Listen to this. December 7th, 1941. A quiet Sunday morning in Hawaii. American sailors are drinking coffee, reading letters from home, getting ready for church. Some are still asleep. And in exactly 53 minutes, over 2,400 of them will be dead. What happened that morning didn't just kill thousands of Americans. It dragged a reluctant nation into the biggest war in human history. It turned the entire Pacific Ocean into a battlefield. And here's the thing most people don't know. Japan actually thought they were making a smart move. They were wrong. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why Japan attacked, how they pulled it off, and the one massive mistake they made that cost them everything. Because what happened at Pearl Harbor wasn't just about ships and planes, it was about a bet. A gamble that Japan was convinced they would win. Spoiler alert, they lost. Here's what you need to understand about 1941. The world is already on fire. Hitler's Germany has conquered most of Europe. Britain is getting hammered by German bombs every single night. The Soviet Union and Germany are tearing each other apart on the Eastern Front. Over in Asia, Japan has been invading China since 1937, committing horrific atrocities that most Americans barely heard about. And the United States? Americans wanted nothing to do with any of it. After World War I, Americans decided that getting involved in European wars was a terrible idea. Over 100,000 American soldiers died in that war. And for what? So France and Britain could redraw some maps? Americans in 1941 looked at what was happening in Europe and Asia and said, not our problem. Opinion polls from 1940 and 1941 showed that roughly 80% of Americans opposed entering the war. President Franklin D. Roosevelt knew better. He saw what was happening. He understood that if Hitler conquered all of Europe and Japan conquered all of Asia, America would eventually be surrounded by hostile empires. But he couldn't just declare war. The American people wouldn't stand for it. Congress wouldn't vote for it. His hands were tied. So Roosevelt did what he could. He sent weapons and supplies to Britain through a program called Lend-Lease. He froze Japanese assets in American banks. He put an oil embargo on Japan, cutting off 80% of their oil supply. Japan's military ran on oil. Their ships, their planes, their tanks, all of it needed oil. And America was their biggest supplier until Roosevelt turned off the tap. Now put yourself in Japan's position for a second. You're in the middle of trying to conquer China and Southeast Asia. Your military is huge and powerful. You've got ambitions to control the entire Pacific. And suddenly, the country that supplies most of your oil says, no more oil for you until you get out of China and stop being aggressive. What would you do? Japan had three options. 1. Give up on China and Southeast Asia, pull back all their forces, and basically admit defeat. That wasn't happening. The military leaders who ran Japan would rather die than accept that kind of humiliation. 2. Find oil somewhere else. The closest oil was in the Dutch East Indies, which is modern-day Indonesia. But the Dutch were allied with Britain, and Britain was at war with Germany, and Japan had signed an alliance with Germany. Taking the Dutch oil fields meant war with Britain, and probably America too. 3. Take out America's Pacific Fleet in one surprise attack, then grab all the oil and resources they needed while America was recovering, and hope that Americans would be so shocked and demoralized that they'd agree to a peace deal. Japan picked option 3. It was the biggest mistake in Japanese history. The man in charge of planning the attack was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. And here's something that's going to blow your mind. Yamamoto didn't want to attack America. He had studied at Harvard. He'd traveled across America. He understood American industrial power, and he knew what would happen if Japan got into a long war with the United States. He told the Japanese government, "I can run wild for 6 months or maybe a year, but after that I have no confidence." Think about that. The guy planning the attack knew it was a bad idea, but he was a military officer, and his government ordered him to do it, so he came up with the best plan he could. And it was a brilliant plan. The Japanese formed a strike force of 6 aircraft carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. These weren't just any carriers. These were the most experienced carrier crews in the world. Japanese naval aviation was second to none in 1941. They had been fighting in China for years. Their pilots had real combat experience. Their torpedo bombers could hit a moving ship from a mile away. Their Zero fighters were faster and more agile than anything the Americans had. The plan was to sail this strike force across the North Pacific in complete radio silence. No transmissions at all. They would approach Hawaii from the north, which was the direction American commanders considered least likely for an attack because the seas were rough and it was far from Japan. They would launch planes in 2 waves, hit the American battleships at Pearl Harbor, destroy the American carrier force if they were in port, wreck the airfields to prevent American planes from fighting back, and then get out before the Americans could organize a counterattack. On November 26, 1941, the strike force left Japan. They sailed east, then north, then east again, refueling at sea from tanker ships. They maintained strict radio silence. Japanese submarines had already been dispatched to scout Pearl Harbor and report on what ships were there. Japanese spies on Oahu, some of them working at the Japanese consulate, were sending back information about where ships were anchored and when they came and went. The Americans had no idea any of this was happening. Actually, that's not quite true. American intelligence had picked up warning signs. The Japanese had changed their naval codes on November the 1st, which they always did before major operations. American codebreakers had lost track of Japan's aircraft carriers. Nobody knew where they were. On November 27th, the US military sent out a warning to Pacific commanders saying that hostile action by Japan was possible at any moment. But nobody expected Pearl Harbor. Why would they? Pearl Harbor was 4,000 miles from Japan. The conventional wisdom said that Japan couldn't project power that far across the ocean. If Japan attacked anywhere, American commanders expected it would be the Philippines, or maybe Guam, or British possessions in Southeast Asia. Hawaii seemed safe. On December 6th, American intelligence intercepted a 14-part message from Tokyo to the Japanese embassy in Washington. The message was clearly breaking off diplomatic negotiations. President Roosevelt read it and said, "This means war." But war where? The message didn't say. Roosevelt and his advisors assumed it meant war in Southeast Asia. That night in Hawaii, American sailors went to bars and movies and spent time with their girlfriends. Officers went to parties. The base was on a low level of alert. Ships were in port for the weekend. Planes were parked wingtip to wingtip on airfields to make them easier to guard against sabotage. Ammunition was locked up. The Army radar station on the north side of Oahu was operating with a skeleton crew that was just there for training. At 6:09 a.m. on December 7th, the first wave of Japanese planes took off from their carriers 230 miles north of Oahu. 183 planes, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, level bombers, and Zero fighters. They formed up and headed south toward Pearl Harbor. At 7:02 a.m., the Army radar station picked them up. A huge blip on the screen, the largest the operators had ever seen. They called the information center to report it. The officer who took the call was a pilot who had recently arrived from the mainland. He figured it was probably a group of B-17 bombers that were scheduled to arrive from California that morning. He told the radar operators, "Don't worry about it." At 7:55 a.m., the first Japanese planes arrived over Oahu. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida was leading the first wave. As he approached Pearl Harbor from the south, he looked down and couldn't believe his luck. Battleship Row, The line of American battleships moored along the southeast side of Ford Island was full of ships. 8 battleships were there. The carriers weren't, which disappointed Fuchida, but 8 battleships was still an incredible target. At 7:55 a.m., Fuchida gave the order to attack. He radioed back to the carriers. Tora, 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 Tiger, Tiger, Tiger. It was the code phrase meaning they had achieved complete surprise. American sailors saw the planes coming in low and fast. At first, some of them thought it was a drill. Then they saw the red circles on the wings, the rising. Son of Japan. Then the bombs started falling and the torpedoes started hitting, and they realized this was real. Let me paint you a picture of what happened in the next 2 hours, because most people have seen the movies, but don't understand the reality. The Japanese had modified their torpedoes specifically for Pearl Harbor. Normal torpedoes dropped from planes would sink too deep in shallow water and hit the harbor bottom. Pearl Harbor's average depth was only 40 feet. Japanese engineers added wooden fins to the torpedoes so they would run shallow. It worked perfectly. The torpedo bombers came in low over the water, just 50 feet up, and launched their torpedoes at the battleships. The battleships were sitting ducks. They were moored in pairs side by side, which meant the inboard ships couldn't even move without the outboard ships moving first. USS Oklahoma was hit by 4 torpedoes in the first few minutes. She rolled over and capsized in 12 minutes. 429 men were trapped inside. Some survived for days in air pockets, banging on the hull, before they drowned or suffocated. Rescuers could hear them, but couldn't cut through the thick steel fast enough. USS West Virginia took 7 torpedo hits. She should have capsized like the Oklahoma, but her damage control officer, who was mortally wounded, ordered counter-flooding, deliberately flooding compartments on the opposite side of the ship to keep her upright. She settled to the bottom of the harbor in an upright position. 106 men died on the West Virginia, but hundreds more survived because of that quick thinking. USS California took 2 torpedo hits and started flooding. The problem was that her watertight doors and hatches had been opened for an inspection the day before, and nobody had closed them all. Water spread throughout the ship. She eventually settled to the bottom with 100 men dead. USS Arizona was hit by a bomb that penetrated her forward magazine, the room where they stored ammunition for the big guns. The magazine exploded. The explosion was so massive that it lifted the front of the ship out of the water. Men on other ships described seeing bodies, parts of the ship, and debris flying hundreds of feet into the air. The Arizona sank in 9 minutes. 1,977 men died. It was over half the total American casualties that day. USS Nevada was the only battleship to get underway during the attack. Her crew managed to start her engines and began moving down the channel towards the harbor entrance. Japanese pilots saw her moving and swarmed her. They wanted to sink her in the channel, which would block the entire harbor. Nevada's acting captain realized what was happening and deliberately ran the ship aground to keep her from blocking the channel. She took 6 bombs and 1 torpedo, but survived. USS Tennessee and USS Maryland were both damaged but stayed afloat. They were the lucky ones. They were moored inboard, meaning they had another ship between them and the torpedo bombers. Pennsylvania was in dry dock getting maintenance, so she was out of the water and couldn't be hit by torpedoes. She took bomb damage, but nothing critical. The 8th battleship, USS Utah, was being used as a target ship for practice bombing. She was moored where a carrier would normally be. Japanese pilots hit her with 2 torpedoes before they realized she wasn't a real combat ship. She capsized. 64 men died. That's the battleships. But the attack wasn't just about battleships. At the airfields, Hickam Field, Wheeler Field, Bellows Field, Kaneohe Naval Air Station, Japanese planes strafed and bombed American aircraft that were parked in neat rows. The Americans had parked them that way to prevent sabotage, but it also made them perfect targets. Over 180 American planes were destroyed on the ground. Most never got into the air. The few American pilots who managed to get airborne fought like crazy. Second Lieutenant George Welch and Second Lieutenant Kenneth Taylor were at a party the night before when the attack started. They drove to their airfield, jumped into P-40 fighters, and took off without waiting for orders. They shot down 7 Japanese planes between them, but there were only a handful of success stories like that. Most American pilots died trying to reach their planes or sat helplessly while their planes burned. At 8:54 a.m., the first wave of Japanese planes withdrew. American sailors and soldiers used the break to fight fires, rescue wounded men, and prepare for what they knew was coming next. At 8:55 a.m., the second wave arrived, 170 more Japanese planes. This time, the Americans were ready. Anti-aircraft guns were manned and firing. The few American planes that had made it into the air were hunting Japanese bombers. The second wave focused on ships that hadn't been hit in the first wave and on airfields and fuel storage tanks. The attack lasted until 9:45 a.m. when the last Japanese planes flew back to their carriers. In less than 2 hours, they had killed 2,403 Americans, 2,008 Navy, 218 Army, 109 Marines, and 68 civilians. They wounded another 1,178. They sank or badly damaged 8 battleships, 3 light cruisers, 3 destroyers, and 4 other vessels. They destroyed 188 aircraft and damaged 159 more. Japanese losses: 29 aircraft, 5 midget submarines, and 129 men. It was one of the most one-sided military victories in history. On the Japanese carriers, pilots landed and were debriefed. Some of them wanted to launch a third wave to hit the fuel storage tanks and the submarine base and the repair facilities. Commander Fuchida argued strongly for it, but Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who was in command of the strike force, said no. He was worried about American carriers. He didn't know where they were. They might be close by. They might be ready to strike back. He decided to withdraw while he was ahead. This was Japan's first big mistake. Maybe not the first mistake. Attacking America at all was the first mistake. But this was the first tactical mistake. The fuel storage tanks at Pearl Harbor held 4.5 million barrels of oil. If the Japanese had destroyed them, the Pacific Fleet would have had to retreat to the west coast. It would have taken months to bring them back. Instead, the tanks were untouched. The submarine base was untouched. The repair facilities were untouched. And most importantly, the American carriers weren't there. USS Enterprise was returning from a mission to Wake Island. USS Lexington was heading to Midway. USS Saratoga was on the west coast for maintenance. The Japanese had hoped to catch all 3 carriers in port, but instead they missed all 3. Those 3 carriers, especially Enterprise, would play a major role in defeating Japan over the next 4 years. Back in Washington, news of the attack reached the White House at around 1:30 p.m. East Coast time. President Roosevelt was having lunch when his secretary told him. Roosevelt immediately began calling his military commanders and cabinet members. The Japanese ambassador was scheduled to deliver the final message, breaking off negotiations at 1 p.m. Washington time, which would have been 7:30 a.m. in Hawaii, half an hour before the attack. That was supposed to give a polite warning that war was coming, but the embassy staff had trouble decoding the message, and the ambassador didn't actually deliver it until 2:20 p.m., more than an hour after the attack had started. So much for a polite warning. December 8, 1941, at 12:30 p.m., President Roosevelt addressed a joint session of Congress. His speech lasted 6 minutes. He called December the 7th, a date which will live in infamy. He described the attack and the losses. Then he asked Congress to declare war on Japan. The vote was 388 to 1 in the House and 82 to 0 in the Senate. The one no vote came from a Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana. a pacifist who had also voted against entering World War I. 3 days later, on December 11th, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. Hitler didn't have to do this. His alliance with Japan only required him to help Japan if Japan was attacked, not if Japan attacked someone else. But Hitler hated America and thought the Americans were weak and divided. He thought declaring war on America wouldn't make much difference because America was already helping Britain. He was wrong. It meant that America could now devote its full attention to defeating Germany instead of just focusing on Japan. Here's what Japan got from Pearl Harbor. They knocked out the American battleship fleet for months. They bought themselves time to invade the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, Burma, and the Dutch East Indies. Between December 1941 and May 1942, Japan conquered territory containing over 450 million people and vast resources of oil, rubber, rice, and minerals. For about 6 months, things went exactly as Admiral Yamamoto predicted. Here's what Japan didn't get. They didn't destroy the American carriers. They didn't destroy the fuel storage or repair facilities that allowed the Pacific Fleet to keep operating. And most importantly, they unified the American people behind the war effort overnight. Remember how 80% of Americans opposed entering the war? That flipped instantly. After Pearl Harbor, Americans were furious and ready to fight. Young men flooded into recruiting stations. Women went to work in factories, building ships and planes and weapons. The entire American economy shifted to war production, and America in 1941 had the largest economy in the world. When America went to full war production, it could outbuild everyone else combined. Japan thought America was soft and wouldn't fight a long war. They were wrong. Admiral Yamamoto knew they were wrong. He told the Japanese government that he could run wild for 6 months or a year, but after that he had no confidence. 6 months after Pearl Harbor was the Battle of Midway in June 1942, where American carrier planes sank 4 of the 6 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor. Japan never recovered. From Midway on, Japan was losing. By 1945, American industry had built over 100 aircraft carriers of various sizes. Japan had built 17. America built over 41,000 aircraft in 1944 alone. Japan built 28,000 aircraft in the entire war. American submarines strangled Japan's supply lines. American B-29 bombers burned Japanese cities to ash. And in August 1945, America dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan, killing over 200,000 people and forcing Japan to surrender. The road from Pearl Harbor to Hiroshima was paved with the bodies of millions of people. Over 400,000 Americans died in World War II. Over 3 million Japanese died. Over 20 million Chinese died. The total global death toll was somewhere between 70 and 85 million people. World War II was the deadliest conflict in human history. There's a conspiracy theory that says Roosevelt knew about the attack in advance and let it happen to get America into the war. This is false. We now have access to Japanese records and American records and the full picture of what happened. Roosevelt knew war was coming. He knew Japan might attack somewhere, but he didn't know where or when, and he definitely didn't know about Pearl Harbor specifically. Could the attack have been prevented? Maybe. If American commanders in Hawaii had been more alert, if the radar operator's warning had been taken seriously, if American intelligence had been better, the damage might have been less severe, but probably not prevented entirely. The Japanese were too well trained and too well prepared. The real question is, why did Japan attack at all? They had to know they couldn't win a long war with America, and the answer is complicated. The Japanese military leadership had a samurai mindset that valued honor and courage over practical thinking. They believed that fighting was better than backing down, even if fighting meant losing. They convinced themselves that Americans were soft and materialistic and would give up rather than fight a hard war. They were catastrophically wrong. Some historians argue that Roosevelt's oil embargo forced Japan to attack. If you cut off someone's oil supply, what choice do they have but to fight? But this argument ignores what Japan was doing in China. Japan had invaded China in 1937. Japanese soldiers raped and murdered hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians in Nanjing. They used Chinese prisoners for biological warfare experiments. They enslaved millions of people. Roosevelt's embargo was a response to Japanese aggression, not the cause of it. Japan could have chosen peace. They chose war instead. Let's talk about some of the people who survived Pearl Harbor, because their stories tell you everything you need to know about that day. Doris Miller was a mess attendant on the USS West Virginia. In 1941, black sailors in the US Navy were only allowed to work as cooks and servants. Miller was serving breakfast when the torpedoes hit. He carried wounded men to safety, including the ship's mortally wounded captain. Then he manned a .50 caliber anti-aircraft gun, a weapon he'd never been trained to use, and shot at Japanese planes until he ran out of ammunition. He was the first black American to receive the Navy Cross. He died 2 years later when his ship was torpedoed near the Gilbert Islands. Mervyn Bennion was the captain of the USS West Virginia. He was on the bridge when a bomb fragment hit him in the stomach, ripping him open. He refused to be moved. He stayed on the bridge, giving orders while he bled out. His last words were directing damage control efforts. He was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. John Finn was a Navy aviator who was at Kaneohe Naval Air Station when the attack started. He set up a machine gun out in the open and fired at Japanese planes for the entire attack, even though he was hit multiple times by return fire and shrapnel. He survived with 20 wounds. He also received the Medal of Honor and lived until 2010. Samuel Fuqua was the damage control officer on the USS Arizona. When the Arizona exploded, he was knocked unconscious. When he came to, the ship was sinking and on fire. He organized rescue parties to pull survivors out of the water and off the burning ship. He stayed on the Arizona until he was sure no more survivors could be saved. He received the Medal of Honor. There were hundreds of stories like this. Men who ran toward danger instead of away from it. Men who saved their friends even though it meant risking their own lives. Men who fought back against overwhelming odds. And then there were the men who didn't survive. The 1,977 men on the Arizona, the 429 men on the Oklahoma, the hundreds of others killed on other ships or in the barracks or on the airfields. Most of them were young. Most of them had never been in combat before. They woke up that Sunday morning thinking about breakfast or church or what they'd do on shore leave. They died before they understood what was happening. The USS Arizona is still at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. It's a war memorial now. Oil still leaks from the wreck about a quart a day. People call them the tears of the Arizona. Over 900 men are still entombed in the ship. Survivors of the Arizona can choose to have their ashes placed in the wreck when they die, to be with their shipmates forever. The last survivor to do this was Lou Conter, who died in 2024 at age 102. Pearl Harbor changed America in ways that went beyond just entering the war. Before Pearl Harbor, America was still a bit isolationist. Americans generally believed that the rest of the world's problems weren't America's business. After Pearl Harbor, that changed. America became a global superpower that maintained military bases around the world and involved itself in conflicts everywhere. For better or worse, Pearl Harbor created the America we know today. Pearl Harbor also changed how wars are fought. The age of the battleship was over. Pearl Harbor proved that aircraft carriers were the new dominant naval weapon. Every major naval battle in the Pacific after Pearl Harbor was decided by carrier aircraft, not by battleship guns. The battleships that were sunk at Pearl Harbor were eventually raised and repaired and sent back into action, but they mostly did shore bombardment and escorted carriers. They were never the queens of the sea again. Pearl Harbor changed American industry. The ships and planes and weapons that won World War II came from American factories. Women who had never worked outside the home before went to work building B-17 bombers and Liberty ships. Rosie the Riveter became a symbol of American industrial might. The factories that built weapons for World War II became the factories that built cars and appliances and electronics in the 1950s and 60s. American prosperity after the war came directly from the industrial capacity built to fight the war. Pearl Harbor changed American society. Over 110,000 Japanese Americans, most of them American citizens, were forced into internment camps after Pearl Harbor because the government feared they might be disloyal. This was one of the greatest injustices in American history. Most of these people lost their homes, their businesses, everything they owned. Many of their sons volunteered to fight for America anyway. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, made up almost entirely of Japanese Americans, became the most decorated unit in American military history. In 1988, the US government officially apologized and paid reparations to surviving internment camp prisoners. What can we learn from Pearl Harbor? First, don't underestimate your enemy. Japan underestimated American resolve. They thought Americans were soft and wouldn't fight. They were wrong. America underestimated Japanese capabilities. They thought Japan couldn't project power across the Pacific. They were wrong. Both sides paid for their mistakes. Second, information matters. American intelligence knew something was coming, but couldn't put the pieces together in time. There were warning signs that got ignored or misinterpreted. This happens in every intelligence failure. It happened before 9/11. It happened before the Iraq War. Having information isn't enough. You have to understand it and act on it. Third, courage matters. When everything goes wrong, when you're outgunned and outmaneuvered, and you have every reason to run or give up, courage is what makes the difference. The men who fought at Pearl Harbor were scared and overwhelmed and in many cases untrained, but they fought anyway. They saved lives anyway. They prevented even worse damage anyway. Fourth, luck matters. The American carriers weren't at Pearl Harbor that day. That was luck. If all three carriers had been in port and been sunk, the entire course of the Pacific War would have been different. Japan might have been able to consolidate their conquests and force a negotiated peace. Or maybe not. American industry might have just built more carriers and won anyway. But luck matters. Fifth, tactics win battles, but strategy wins wars. Japan won the tactical battle at Pearl Harbor. They sank ships, killed thousands of Americans, and got away almost untouched, but they lost the strategic war. They turned a neutral power into a committed enemy. They galvanized American public opinion. They gave America a reason to fully mobilize its industrial might. Yamamoto understood this. The other Japanese leaders didn't, or they didn't care. They won the battle and lost the war. Every year on December 7th, Pearl Harbor survivors gather at the memorial to remember their fallen friends. There are fewer survivors every year. In 1991, on the 50th anniversary, there were thousands. In 2021, on the 80th anniversary, there were fewer than 30. Most of them are in their late 90s or over 100 years old now. Soon there won't be any left, but the memory remains. The USS Arizona Memorial in Pearl Harbor receives over 1 million visitors a year. Museums across America have Pearl Harbor exhibits. Schools teach about it. Movies and documentaries keep the story alive. We say, never forget because we mean it. Why does Pearl Harbor still matter 80+ years later? Because it was a turning point. It was the moment when America stopped looking inward and started looking at the world. It was the moment when America went from a bystander to a participant in world affairs. Everything that came after, the Cold War, the Korean War, Vietnam, the Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan, all of it traces back to the choice America made after Pearl Harbor to remain engaged with the world. Was that the right choice? That's a political question, and people disagree. But it's the choice America made, and Pearl Harbor was the reason. There's also a human reason why Pearl Harbor still matters. 2,403 people went to work on a Sunday morning and never came home. They were sons and brothers and husbands and fathers. They had plans for Christmas. They had people waiting for them. They had futures that never happened. We remember Pearl Harbor not just because it changed history, but because 2,403 individual lives ended that day, and each one of them mattered. History is full of what-ifs, and Pearl Harbor has more than most. What if the carriers had been in port? The Japanese would have sunk them, and America would have had no carriers in the Pacific. This would have delayed American counterattacks by months or even years. But America was already building new carriers. Essex-class carriers started entering service in 1943. America would have won eventually, but it might have taken longer and cost more lives. What if the Japanese had launched a third wave? If they had destroyed the fuel tanks and repair facilities, the Pacific Fleet would have had to withdraw to California. This would have given Japan months more time to consolidate their conquests in Southeast Asia, but American submarines and carriers would still have been operational. The outcome would probably have been the same, just delayed. What if Japan had never attacked? If Japan had backed down, withdrawn from China, and accepted American demands, there would have been no war in the Pacific. But the Japanese military leadership would never have accepted that. They believed backing down was dishonorable. They preferred war to humiliation. So this what-if is really impossible. Given who the Japanese leaders were, they were always going to choose war. What if America had stayed neutral? If Pearl Harbor had never happened, would America have entered World War II at all? Probably yes, but maybe not until later. Hitler declared war on America after Pearl Harbor. So without Pearl Harbor, maybe Germany and America would have stayed neutral toward each other while America just fought Japan. Or maybe Roosevelt would have found another way to enter the war in Europe. We'll never know. What if the attack had failed? What if the Japanese strike force had been spotted early and American carriers had been able to launch a counterattack? Japan would have lost carriers and their strategic position would have been much worse. The war might have been shorter, but again, this was unlikely. The Japanese plan was too good and American defenses were too weak for the attack to fail completely. The most interesting what-if is this. What if Japanese leaders had listened to Yamamoto? He knew attacking America was a mistake. He knew Japan couldn't win a long war. What if instead of attacking Pearl Harbor, Japan had consolidated their position in China and Southeast Asia and fortified the perimeter, making themselves too expensive to attack? America might have focused on Europe and left Japan alone. The British and Dutch were already fighting Germany. They might not have had the resources to push Japan out of Southeast Asia. Japan might have kept their empire, but that would have required Japanese leaders to accept limits, and they weren't willing to do that. They wanted the whole Pacific. They thought they deserved it. They thought they could take it. They were wrong. December 7th, 1941 was a Sunday. The weather was partly cloudy. The temperature was around 78 degrees. Waves lapped gently against the hulls of battleships in Pearl Harbor. American sailors were going about their usual Sunday routines. By 10 a.m., over 2,400 of them were dead. 8 battleships were sunk or damaged. Over 180 aircraft were destroyed. The Pacific Fleet was crippled. Japan thought they had won. They lost. 3 years and 8 months later, American bombers dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered. The war was over. America had won. The cost was millions of lives on all sides, cities destroyed, families shattered, a generation scarred by war. And it all started because Japan made a bet. They bet that one surprise attack would knock America out of the fight. They bet that Americans were too soft and divided to fight back. They bet that they could grab what they wanted and hold it. They lost every bet. Pearl Harbor wasn't just an attack on ships and planes. It was an attack on the idea that America could stay out of the world's problems. It was an attack that forced America to choose between fighting and surrendering. America chose to fight. And once America committed to fighting, the outcome was never really in doubt. It was just a question of how long it would take and how much it would cost. Today, the USS Arizona rests at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. The memorial stands over it. Oil still seeps from the wreck. Visitors from around the world come to pay their respects. They look down at the white marble wall with the names of the 1,177 men who died on the ship. They're quiet, they're respectful, they're remembering. And that's what we should do, remember. Remember the men who died. Remember the men who fought. Remember the lesson that peace is fragile and freedom isn't free. Remember that decisions made by leaders in comfortable offices have consequences for young men far from home. Remember that war is hell and should always be the last resort. Pearl Harbor happened because leaders on both sides made bad choices. Japanese leaders chose conquest over peace. American leaders failed to see the threat until it was too late. The men who paid the price were the ones who had no choice at all, the sailors and soldiers who followed orders and did their duty and died for their country. We remember them because they deserve to be remembered. If you learned something today, hit subscribe. I've got more history coming your way.